Hello everyone, you're all very welcome to this Earth Institute event. So my name is Eoin O'Neill. I'm Director of the Earth Institute, UCD Research Institute for Environment, Climate and Sustainability Research. So this particular event is the third in a Democracy and Environment series. We had our first in March on rural transitions, the second in April on trust and expertise, with a focus on climate action and transport. And today we have our third event on Irish towns and vacancy and data. Philip Crowe is the lead from UCD on this one, Dr Gavin McArdle. So I'll just say a little bit about Philip. Philip's going to chair the event, so I'm just going to give him a little bio before he will introduce our two other respective contributors. So Philip's UCD Assistant Professor for Climate Responsive Design in the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy and the School of Civil Engineering. He's a joint appointment. He's co-director of the UCD Centre for Irish Towns, program director of the MSc in Architecture, Urbanism and Climate Action, and director of research in the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy, working on a range of EU and nationally funded research projects related to town revitalisation, vacancy and adaptive reuse, compact urban growth, urban resilience and citizen participation. And he was previously director of sustainable design at MCO Dublin architecture practice from 2003 to 2012. Our two other contributors would see contributions from Ali Harvey, who's worked with Nicholas O'Dwyer Ltd, and Dr Gavin McArdle, UCD School of Computer Science and CeDAR, a research centre. So I'll let Philip oversee the introductions, but as well invite Philip to the topic.
Thanks, Eoin. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for coming. There's a lot of very familiar faces in the audience. There's a lot of people who have helped the Centre for Irish Towns and sponsored the Centre for Irish Towns, not least of which is Ali Harvey in the front row. But also there's a lot of people here who have contributed to this project that I'm going to talk about today, which is called Vacancy Map Ireland, or at least it was originally called Vacancy Map Ireland. We've been through a bit of a journey and we're now calling ourselves Building Stories. The whole point of these research projects is you go through a bit of a journey. So that journey is really what I'm going to talk about today. I should start really by thanking Eoin and the Earth Institute, because the Centre for Irish Towns wouldn't really exist if it wasn't for the Earth Institute. They gave us our starting funding. We don't have funding, but they gave us money to get going. And they've been hugely supportive, in particular Katrina, who's here today on her birthday. And she's celebrating it in a very eccentric style by coming to this seminar. So as I say, we have a number of sponsors, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Ali Harvey, who is one of the key supports for the centre over the last number of years. So CfIT, just for those who don't know, is a transdisciplinary centre within the UCD. What we try to do is bring together research that's focused on Irish towns. And we also try to generate research projects. And that's kind of what we spend most of our time doing. And so rather than sort of bombard you, I suppose, with lots of things that we're doing, I thought today I'd just focus on the one project. So today I'm just going to focus on this one, which is Vacancy Map Ireland, now renamed and transitioned to Building Stories. So I'm doing the wrong thing. This is a SFI-funded project, and it's under a program called National Challenge Fund. And the National Challenge Fund is a significant program funding, and there's different streams. And our stream, just to put this all in context, is the Our Tech Challenge. And it is about basically improving the connection between communities and local government and policymakers through digital technologies. So the full description is on the screen, and hopefully you'll see why this particular project is appropriate to that. I have the team here. So we have Anna and we have Gavin. And we don't have Jack. Is Jack here? No, Jack probably arrived slightly late. So we have a small team in UCD, and we also have Julia, wave Julia, who is our fantastic PhD student from the University of Calgary, who is multilingual, and that has been rather useful, as you'll see shortly. So just to provide some background to this research, so the project is basically a map of vacancy. How do we generate a map of vacancy in Ireland? And I would always go back to my own PhD research, which looked at this map, or uncovered this map from 1914, which is basically a map of the adaptive capacity of the city of Dublin to cope with what was an absolutely horrendous housing crisis at the time, sort of unimaginable level of deprivation in the city centre. And this map has various categories for vacancy. So it has derelict sites, it has buildings that have collapsed, it has insanitary areas, I think. So I identified this as being a map of the potential to address or manage a housing crisis. And it is found in the appendix to a housing inquiry it's an inquiry into the housing conditions of the working class in the city of Dublin, and the date is 1914. Very similar maps exist of vacancy from the same date that were the basis for the Dublin Town Planning Competition, and they map all the opportunity spaces or the adaptive capacity of the city. So I suppose the premise of this project that I'm going to describe now is that we don't really have that. We still don't have that comprehensive dynamic, where they didn't have a dynamic one, and at the moment we don't have a comprehensive, dynamic and open geospatial database on vacancy, particularly at the granular scale of individual sites. And the basic underlying premise then of the project is that in Ireland, we don't use space efficiently in our cities and our towns, and we're particularly interested in towns in this project. And if we don't use our built environment efficiently, then that has knock-on impacts, obviously, on several major issues, such as the housing crisis, such as the need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from new construction, and then also the need to revitalise our town centres for living in. And we are not alone in thinking this. As Ali knows, almost every policy document that comes out of the government and all sorts of other studies have pointed to the need for this data set. So the quote here is from one of those, but it occurs in Housing for All, in the Town Centre First policy approach. In this one, which is Vacant Homes Action Plan, which only came out last year, this is a quote directly from the challenge for policymakers and stakeholders is to identify a data baseline which can be used at a high level to report on vacancy and develop policy, but can also be interrogated at a granular level to enable the reactivation of vacant properties. And there's a number of other studies that the team has worked on, and some of them I've worked on with people in the audience. The one on the left there, the Town Centre Living Initiative, identified through the study of 6 towns in terms of why are buildings vacant in the town centres, why are more people not living there, identified in a suggested action, we need this data set. The Collaborative Town Centre Health Check, which Ali instigated back in about 2016, I guess, identified this and many other major gaps in data in the country that are absolutely critical for our towns. And then the third study on the right, this is just an image from it, I was commissioned to do it by Ali and the housing agency. And it was looking into how do different countries or cities generate data on vacancy and how do they use it. And one of those examples was the city of Philadelphia. And the city of Philadelphia has this thing called the Vacant Property Indicators Model. And what it does is that it brings in various proxy data sets into a geospatial model, and then it penetrates through those data sets to learn how to tell if a building or a property is potentially vacant, the likelihood of vacancy. So we thought that was quite an interesting premise. Back in 2018, I think, Ali and myself and the housing agency and Mayo County Council went to the department, and we put forward this as a proposal, as something is absolutely necessary, it's absolutely possible, and we do it. And we didn't get very far with that. So this project, this SFI project, is really an opportunity to bring that up again. And so we use that model basically as the basis for our proposal. So this is one of those diagrams you put together very quickly the night before you submit an application. It's done on Miro, I think. So, but basically the idea is you get these proxy data sets. So they could be anything from water data sets, could be mobile phone data sets, could be remote sensing data sets, put them all into a data set. You then teach that through AI, so machine learning and deep learning, to identify the likelihood of vacancy. You then get a map, you engage with citizens for ground truthing to verify the data, and you benefit all these different programs that are listed up on the right, and it helps with the implementation of lots of policy. So that was the premise for the project. We then, as I say, we started in June last year, so we're in month 12 of 18. see the timeline along the bottom. So the first phase was a concept phase for 6 months, and we are now in a seed phase, which ends in November. And we've gone through various activities, and it's those activities that I'm just going to briefly describe, and Gavin's going to come in on the data audit and the geospatial model. So those 4: stakeholder engagement, data audit, geospatial model, and EU case studies are kind of the structure for this presentation. So in terms of the stakeholder engagement part of it, what SFI wanted us all to do at the start was to basically break down the challenge and make sure we understood it properly, which was fair enough. It's a good idea because we come in with lots of presumptions that we know everything and we're right about it. So we went and started a fairly intense process of stakeholder engagement. I think we interviewed over 30 different organizations and people, some of whom, as I say, are in the room, and thank you, all of you, for taking part in that. And then we took the results and we analyzed them, put them into themes. So just very quickly, I'm not going to go through all of the themes that we came up with, but the first question was really, what's your experience of using the existing data that is on vacancy in Ireland? And these are 3 of the themes that came up, but the first one there, a lack of a concise definition, is hugely problematic, experienced by a lot of different stakeholders. There were comments about how within the same organization, you'd have multiple different definitions of vacancy, and also that how you define vacancy depends on who you are, where you're coming from, what you are actually measuring. So you end up with lots of different figures from different sources who are all measuring things slightly differently. And that's hugely problematic because it undermines any data set. The lack of data then is, there were a lot of criticisms of existing sources of data that might have been to do with how reliable they were, and all of them were unreliable, how comprehensive they were, what was the methodology for generating the data. So there was, we have quotes here, so the quote on the left, that the data landscape at the moment is just completely inadequate in this area. So all of this is just confirming sort of the hypotheses that we started out with in the project. And so it's not us saying it, it is a fairly large group of key stakeholders. And then this idea that there's a lack of strategic or coordinated approach to tackle vacancy. So that's commenting on the fact that there's multiple different policies. How coordinated are they? There's this obsession with a single plot that came up a lot, and not the overall urban block or the town centre. And there's just a lack of a coordinated approach, maybe, and a lack of resources came up a lot in local authorities. And another question we asked was, well, how would you benefit from having this open, accessible geospatial data model on vacancy? So these themes came up that it would help people understand patterns and distribution of vacancy, so that the overall percentage or the overall number is not the point, it's where is it? So it has a huge impact by being concentrated, say, in town centres. There were quite a few stakeholders that maybe would surprise people that would find this very useful. So for example, the fire service would find this extremely useful because they would then know what they were coming out to if they got a call. Hugely different if you're going to a vacant property as opposed to a fully occupied property. There were a lot of people saying it would be really useful because they could then understand what would be involved in bringing the building back into use. So they weren't just interested in, is it vacant or not? It's, well, what state is it in? What would need to be done to bring it back into use, or to bring it back to a high level maybe of energy efficiency, etc. And then to provide a management tool for the built environment. So basically local authorities, AHBs saying, look, this would be an incredibly useful data set for managing buildings. We just don't have it at the moment. And it would be really useful if it had more, it was about more than just vacancy. And one of the other things I should have said in terms of what information would be really useful in bringing back into use was ownership. That ownership is a huge hurdle and massive resources. And I know there's people in the audience know this better than I do. Massive resources spent just simply trying to find out who owns a property. So local authorities across the country putting huge amount of manpower and time into that. So we've done a number of things with the data. I thought I'd show you this one. So we're playing with the vacancy definitions. It's not easy. I wouldn't claim that we've solved it. But Anna's been mapping here basically an adaptive cycle for a building. So we're seeing how useful is it to frame vacancy as a dimension of adaptive capacity. So we're going back to that map from 1914. and looking vacancy as a sort of spatial dimension of urban resilience of the adaptive capacity of a place. And what we're trying to map here is where in a building's life cycle are there opportunities for it to be vacant. And then we want to try and understand when does that happen in time, and when does it happen in terms of resources required to bring it back into use. So the first, I'm seeing lots of confused faces. But the first gradient is basically when the building is being constructed. In some data sets, that is counted as vacant. You then are in use, and you're used for a period of time. The condition might deteriorate, would particularly deteriorate if there's a period of vacancy when it's not being used, but that could be simply due to it being for sale or to be up for rent, or somebody might have gone into a home, etc. But it might get to a point at number 4 where there was a certain amount of resources required to bring it back up into habitable use. Equally, it could descend further down and greater resources would be required to bring it back up into use. And what we really need to do is to try and manage our built environment in that top fair condition band at the top. So I'm going to just hand over to Gavin, because one of the great things about working in the university is that and this type of funding is that you work with colleagues who are in different schools and can do things that you have no idea about. And so Gavin and I have collaborated on this project, and Gavin is an associate professor in the School of Computer Science in UCD. So Gavin, do you want to, I'll give you this. Oh yes, you need that.
Great. Thanks very much for the introduction, and hi everybody. So we've seen the view of the stakeholders that it would be really good to have this resource where we can understand vacancy in Ireland, maybe even predict it. But we also saw that there's a problem with the data. And so one of the tasks that I was involved in was a data audit. So everybody knows the problem and what we want to do. So we looked at the different data sets that are out there. Our focus was to try and use open data. So this would mean that we could publish it, we could allow it to be used and reused. So we focus mainly on open data sources like the data.gov, local authorities, CSO, to identify any kind of data sets that has something to do with vacancy, would tell us something about a building's vacancy. And what we saw was that really there's a handful of data sets that have vacant data in it, or have data about vacancy in it. So we weren't inundated with loads of data to allow us to do this great machine learning model where we could give it some data again to learn from the data, and this is what a vacant property looks like. We didn't have that luxury. So we're going to have to work with other data sets. Those that were there were of poor quality. So when I say poor quality, I'm saying there's variables missing, there's data absent, there's a lot of cleaning required, there's duplication. These kind of things are present in the data sets that are out there. But the key thing, and it's really important, it's kind of coming through in the stakeholder engagement as well, is this lack of interoperability. So even when there are data sets about buildings available, they're not linked together. There's no common thread, there's no common index, there's no common ID to say, this data is about this building, this data is about this building, this data is about this building. There's no common variable there to say these are all the same building. So this lack of interoperability also extends to the actual format of the files or the format of the data. Often they're not always machine readable. Sometimes it's a PDF report. And what do you do with that? You can't process that automatically. In other cases, the data is covering different spatial granularities or different timescales. So there's all these challenges of making data about buildings be able to work together. And what this highlights is that the data is in fact in silos. So different departments, different agencies have some data about vacancy or about buildings, but it's not linked to other departments or vacancies or agencies that have this data or similar data. So they don't seem to talk to it. The data sets don't talk to each other, and maybe the agencies don't talk to each other either. So in some cases, we identified really nice data sets that we would like to use. They're not in the open access portals. We requested them. And there's different reasons given for why they couldn't share them with us around privacy and things like that, which we're starting to examine the real reason why we can't get this data. So this meant that we had to extend beyond vacancy and see what other data about buildings we could access. And could that be used to somehow infer that a building is vacant? And you'll see in a minute the data sets that we're able to access. As part of this data audit, we were speaking to stakeholders as well. We kind of primarily focused on those that we thought would have data useful for this type of project. So you can see we spoke to the utility company. So you can imagine if we know the details of a service or utility going into a building, it might tell us about the occupancy. For example, a low use of electricity maybe indicates that the building is vacant. But unfortunately, we weren't able to get any of this data for the project. It would be a really nice data set. We spoke to local authorities, government agencies about the data that they had. Often it's at too high a spatial scale for us to be able to infer anything about individual buildings. So it might represent different electoral divisions or county level and things like that. Also, we spoke to regional assemblies and Táilte Éireann and CSO. And again, we were just saying, what data do you have that could be useful to us? In some cases, Táilte Éireann and CSO pointed us to some relevant data sets that we were able to integrate because they had details about an individual building. But what we saw was that these stakeholder interviews reflected what Philip already said about this lack of connected data, this lack of data infrastructures at a national level to be able to link things together. So speaking to them about the data they had and about their feelings of this project, you can see it's the same kind of things that we were experiencing. The data quality, the data scarcity, and then just issues with being able to link the data that is already there. And so as part of this, that led from us focusing purely on vacancy and trying to identify vacancy and dereliction to seeing what information we could get at the building level, because this gap of building level data began to emerge. So I said our remit, or what we wanted to do initially, was to use open access data. That wasn't possible. We were able to use open access and free software packages to process the data that we got. The data sets that we were able to use are shown there, so there's several of them. But what we needed to do was unify them in some way and get a common data point for them. So we looked at Táilte Éireann and we used their building data sets. That data set is nice. It has a unique ID for each building in Ireland. So that's our starting point. We use that as a reference. And every data set then has to be mapped onto that using different types of data cleaning and processing steps, spatial joins, spatial queries, and things like that to link everything together under one ID for the building now. So the data sets that we use were things like air codes. And you might think that air code in itself could be an identifier of a building, but it's not really. There's lots of duplicates within the air code database because it's more representing a location rather than an individual building or an individual property. Other data sets that we include are the building data from GeoDirectory. This is a nice data set. It tells us about the building use, the building footprint, for example. It also has an indicator of whether or not a post person has indicated the building as vacant or derelict. So we're starting to integrate that as well. We also have data from the Land Development Agency. So if it's a state-owned land parcel or property, we have that information. We have data from the property price register. So if the property was sold, we have data about the date of the sale, the price of the sale, and things like that. We have data from the rental or the residency's tenancy board. So if it's a rental property, we can pull that data in. So you can start to see how we're building up a story about the building because we're pulling these different data sets that refer to the building together. And they haven't been put together before due to the technical problems, and also just a lack of I guess, a drive to do this. Other data that we have there is valuation. We also have, if the building is in the National Inventory of Architecture and Heritage, if the building appears in that, we can say it is. And then we can associate boundary data, the electoral divisions, what county a building is in. So it's all this building data is being put together in one place for the first time in our data model. So to test this, we took 3 different towns in Ireland. We took Tipperary, Monaghan, and Ballina. And we applied our model to it. So we took the Táilte Éireann buildings footprints and we linked the data sets that we could find about buildings in those towns together as a demonstration of it. And this is what we have. We now have a database which has all this information for every building in these 3 case study towns. We can query it across any of the variables. We've developed a user interface where we can click on a building and we can find out some information about it. So the top box there is showing this important ID of the building from Táilte Éireann. That's the key for everything. But we also have some information about the dereliction and vacancy that comes from GeoDirectory. The building use is business and the air code is there as well. So that's all together now in one place, a couple of different data sets merged. Below that, we can see that this is for a different property, but it has a address for both the property price register and for rental. So this building was sold recently and is being rented. We can see the value that is the market price of it sold for, description of the property, the number of bedrooms. So this is all being put together for the first time. It wasn't possible to see this in one place before. You can see some of the challenges there for the address given for the rental address and the property price ratio address. They're different. So there's an issue there in even how we format addresses, which makes it challenging to merge these data sets. So this is the kind of the state of the model at the moment. Philip said at the start, we want to estimate the likelihood of a building being vacant. So what we need to do is continue to get more data sets, put them together, show machine learning that this looks like a vacant property, or this is a vacant property. What can you learn from the features of it? And we hope to end up with something like this, whereby we can query properties in a more visual and intuitive way than just the plain map. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Gavin. Thanks a million. So you can see that we actually pivoted very slightly. Maybe it's very subtle, but so instead of setting out to map vacancy, we're setting out to build up a huge database on buildings that is multi-layered and that can then be filtered in numerous different ways. But that one of the ways you could filter it is to see, is there a certain type of vacancy prevalent in a certain area? Can you find certain properties if you're, say, an approved housing body, etc., and start interrogating that data set? So what we thought we would do next is have a look at some precedents. And through a contact that Ali gave us in Housing Europe, we came across a number of examples, and this one is in France. And interestingly, France have gone through a similar journey in that they started out trying to do something that was to do with renovation called Go Rénover. And they were trying with that data set to figure out what was needed to different properties to bring them up to an energy efficiency level that was required. So that was the original motivation. While they were doing that, they effectively figured out that they were gathering an awful lot more information to figure that out. And so their project, I don't know, it has turned into an even larger project called Base de Données Nationales des Bâtiments, which is basically a database on the buildings in France, which they've been doing for a couple of years. You can imagine the scale of that. The way they've done it is that they started out with 3 core data sets that are to do with addresses, to do with the building footprint and the height of the building, but also critically really good, well, I presume it's pretty good tax data, which would have all sorts of different categories. They then build up on that with up to 30 different data sets. Those data sets include things like energy use, gas use, national assets, state assets, what the building's built from, heritage profiles, etc. And so you get to a stage where you have up to 200 to 400 pieces of information per building in the country. They have different levels or tiers of access. So they have a bottom tier, which is non-sensitive data and is completely open. And then it gets gradually more difficult. The top one is actually more like a consultancy service, I think. The middle one is really for local authorities. They were pretty horrified that we were suggesting our model would be completely open. There was sort of quelle horreur at that. They didn't see how that would work. But this is how their one works, and this is the sort of information. So you start building up essentially sort of building identity cards or building passports, or we start moving into the area of building renovation passports that the IGBC has been working on here. So we thought that was pretty amazing. And we thought, well, maybe this is actually what we need to do. We thought this was perhaps a more relevant precedent than the one in Philadelphia, because it's in Europe. They're our nearest European neighbors, EU neighbors, so they're subject to very similar with the same laws in terms of privacy, data privacy, etc. So we went and we did a couple of focus groups, and we asked the first question, which was, do you think a tool like BNDB would be useful in Ireland? Pretty much everybody ignored that question because it was so blatantly obvious. Of course, it would be unbelievably useful. So we got very positive feedback on that, not surprisingly. We then asked, well, what do you see as the main barriers to creating a similar model for Ireland? And we've got a lot of complex answers to that, which we need to engage with now. And that's possibly our next, but it is our next stage. So we've identified socio-cultural barriers, simply things to do with a mindset, to do with sharing, to do with quality, technical barriers. There are difficult things to do, but in the project that we've been working on, we actually have got to this stage where we have the geospatial model that data sets can feed into. And we kind of predicted that would be the really, really difficult thing to do. And it was very difficult and took a huge amount of time, but it is totally possible. Then there's financial interest. So current data holders have a financial interest in keeping their data to themselves, or that you pay for it, etc. But then there's other things to do with, as Gavin, you inferred it, to do with quality and people being scared to share their data, possibly because of the quality of it, or that they'd be caught out because there was some inaccuracy or it hadn't been maintained properly. And that's actually consistent with the first of these seminars when Karen Coveney spoke about one of her projects with Citizen Rural, looking at data sets in rural areas or rural data sets, and they're coming up with the same findings, and that this is one of the problems. So we've made this momentous shift. We are now building stories. We may have another transition at some point in the near future. And so what we are doing now is we are saying, well, it's not just to do with getting access to data sets. We thought, well, why won't people give us their data sets? It's actually more complex than that. There are probably good reasons why they don't give us access. And we've learned from colleagues in the Land Development Agency, and Killian, who's here, that even whenever you have legal powers to get these data sets, they are not forthcoming. And there are a lot of fears around giving them out to other agencies. So what we want to do is reverse back up the chain and try and understand what's going on there. And we want to understand why, but we also want to make the case, because as Gavin was saying, these data sets are in silos. So if you are in control of, if you're a data controller of a particular data set, it may not seem evident to you how useful that data set is. So your data set maybe is on how much different buildings are used, how much water is being used, etc. On its own, maybe you don't think that that is that useful. You can't see maybe a social good in that. But if we combine it, this is what we need to make clear, if you combine it like the French have done, then you suddenly have an incredibly powerful data set that can address social issues, social challenges, societal challenges. So we think the left-hand column there is our main work for the next 6 months. We have a whole lot of other things that we can keep ourselves busy at, because I suspect the column on the left might be a bit frustrating and difficult. But we also want to start bringing in satellite data and ground truth imagery into our model. But we've got to a stage that I never expected to get to so quickly, which is we have the geospatial model. I thought that was what we were going to be doing for the whole period of time. This is actually the challenge now. And it's not gaining access, it's trying to understand why access is not being given and what are the problems with those individual data sets that would be key. So this is just quickly, we have to go through various phases. We may not get into the next phase, but if we do, we're going to lend our model to a local authority and use their data sets, because we have certain data sets in UCD that we have licenses for and that we can use. But we can't share them with people due to lots of legal reasons. But if we went to a local authority, perhaps Dublin City Council, perhaps Monaghan County Council, and said, look, here's the model, let's put in all your data sets. We could investigate, well, what does that do? How useful is that? What information is coming up? What is missing? And then if we get through to the prize phase, this is a whole entrepreneurial model that SFI uses, then we might try and see how do we create an open model that, why is this data private? It has a very strong societal good aspect to it. Can we make an open model of it? So we haven't really veered off where we wanted to be. The impact is the same. We're still saying that if we have a good quality data on the built environment at the granular scale that is accessible, that everybody can get to, is regularly updated, then we will understand the built environment better and we can then manage it and we can use it efficiently. And that has huge knock-on effects, as I say, in terms of housing, in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and in terms of revitalizing our historic town centres. So I hope that made sense. I'm definitely over time. So I'm going to invite Gavin and Ali to come up to the front, and I'm going to facilitate a discussion, but I'm going to start by asking Ali to give us some response and reflections of the research, perhaps in the larger scale. We should sit where we're being allocated. Okay. What will I do with this one? Leave it. Okay. So if I could just introduce Ali. So I've mentioned that Ali has been a key sponsor and supporter of the Centre for Irish Towns. Ali instigated the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check, which has been hugely important in terms of data in towns back in, I'd say, 2015, 2016, I think I mentioned. Ali is now principal planner and project manager in Nicholas O'Dwyer Ltd planning consultants, and a huge supporter of this project. And Ali, if you'd like to give some reflections.
Thanks very much. Okay, so yeah, as you say, great to see so many familiar faces here today. So I suppose first off, just to start by thanking SFI Science Foundation Ireland, because as Philip said, we went to the department in 2018 with this project and had actually brainstormed it and written it up with the housing agency, and also Tom Gilligan, who is vacanthomes.ie. So it's just wonderful to get this support. So I suppose really for me, the journey that I've been on the last, I'd say I was actually coming up here today, I was thinking, my goodness, it's 8 years. So when I set up the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check sort of framework, it was because business leaders came to me and asked me, could I help? And I think you and I had sort of met around the same time too. We'd been introduced at a conference on regeneration. So really my whole background is, I suppose, collaboration. Okay, so really what I see, Philip, from what you've been talking about, you and Gavin, you know, we really need to create a culture in this country of collaboration. And the OECD brought out a report, a wonderful report last year, talking about how to strengthen policy development and implementation in Ireland. And one of the key things, one of the key findings that they found was we don't have a culture. We don't have, we have a lack of systemic and systemized collaboration, which is hard to believe for such a small country, you know. And also the OECD previously said in 2005, I think it was a year before I set up the Irish Walled Towns Network, that we really have a relationship-based society. So I find that there's a bit of a disconnect there. If we've got a relationship-based society, we should be much better at collaboration. And also we should be setting up networks everywhere. That's another thing that the OECD advised. And again, sorry, I have to keep quoting the OECD because that's how I got my first degree, reading all their reports. They just write such good reports. In 2019, they also highlighted that Ireland really needed a data-driven public sector. Okay, so you're talking like 2019, like we're sort of, we just keep waiting and waiting. 2018, we went to the department. 2016, I set up the CTCHC approach, which was a 15-step methodology of how to create primary data baselines. So, I mean, I really do, I suppose today I really want to feel that we're optimistic, that we can get change, that we can build this new culture where everybody shares and everybody works together, because really, and the regional assemblies have been very clear on this, which is really, really good, you know, that we're being held back. There's lots of money available from the European Union, and we can't get it into the country because we can't show the Europeans the way that they do their ex-ante appraisals, because we don't have that system. And again, from what the OECD is saying, is that our policy, and we are sort of not very good at doing policy implementation because we don't know how to sort of follow through with the data. So the policy must be based on data. And also we need to get better at doing implementation and measuring of policy. So before we even create a policy, we should have the ex-ante appraisals. And to do that, we need the data. And then at the very end of the policy, there should be an ex-post evaluation. And if we don't have the data, like, you know, what are we doing policy for? Because for me, it's a fundamental. Policy is about having data, you know. So that's really, I suppose, where I came from back in 2016 when the business leaders came to me and said, can you help? I couldn't believe, I think you and I were the same, you know, when we did all those workshops with the business and civic leaders, we couldn't believe that the data didn't actually exist. So we set about creating that data. But I think what is wonderful for me is to try and pin this all and align it all with the SDGs, which Ireland actually created. So Ireland actually drafted the SDGs with Kenya. And I think it's wonderful. We should really, you know, take ownership of those SDGs as a country, and use those SDGs to sort of pivot our, as I say, the way that we do things, our civil service. You know, I think definitely we need to have a digital transformation. Europe is calling for a digital transformation. And we have this opportunity now. You know, we've been trying for a few years. We just need to break through and to try and get through those sort of blockages and barriers, as you say.
And I suppose it's interesting that really our task for the next 6 months is to ask different data owners to collaborate and see a shared vision. I mean, if you look at the French one, I think Julia will be able to remind me of all the different organizations that collaborated in France to produce that. It starts with the ministry, which is the Ministry of Ecology and Social Cohesion, or some territorial cohesion. And then there's the equivalent of the housing agency, and there's several that I couldn't translate in my GCSE French from Ali and I are both from the same part of the world, so we both.
I was
You-
French as well.
No, I'm brilliant at it. Thank goodness for Julia. But what was really striking about the French model is collaboration, exactly that, and that they purposely are setting out to have this data set so that they can address a shared challenge, which originally was to do with energy efficiency. So this idea of collaborating over data and seeing the bigger picture rather than just the individual does seem to be a major hurdle that we have to cope with.
I think so. And when you actually look at the sort of end game, which is that we're not getting the investment in, because, you know, when we did the CTCHC baselines, the private sector was sort of saying, this is exactly what we need to talk to investors. Okay. And then the civic leaders were saying, this is exactly what we need because we know what our vacancy rate is at last. Do you know what I mean? So you're looking at investment, you're looking at funding, like that's the end game. Do you know what I mean? To get that in. And if we can't get on that pathway, that winning pathway, as Europe calls it, you know, we really, I suppose we're letting down our citizens, aren't we, really, you know?
Yeah, I think it's important. We've shown that the technical barriers can be overcome by building this model. Now it's about the collaboration and getting people to work together, the social and the interaction barriers that are there to get the data into a shared model. So it's not the technical aspects that are holding things up.
And one of the things, Ali, as you always say, is that we need this data set in order to be able to monitor and evaluate. And that if you don't have that, you can't see the change or the shift that's happened. And say there's been numerous different policies that are inconsistent in how successful they are. I think it's fair to say it very much depends on who is delivering the policy, but we don't have the data nationwide to show, well, this is the impact of X.
I think that's it, Philip. And I mean, the OECD again nails it and sort of says, you know, if you don't have the data and you're not monitoring and you can't track, then you can't change direction if the policy isn't working. You just keep doing the policy, even though you know it doesn't work. So, I mean, for me, my background's economics. You know, I really want to sort of have a policy that is data driven, as the OECD has already said 5 years ago, that we get the best bang for our buck or euro, whatever, that we get value for money, VFM. And at the minute, you know, it's hard to sort of measure our policy for VFM because we don't have this data system, this data baseline in place. So, you know, again, I suppose growing up in Northern Ireland, and I worked in the north before I came down south, the European, you know, Peace and Rec 1 came in after the peace agreement, and, you know, there was 240 million in that first round. I was just starting out as a consultant. You know, we were bound by the European rules and also by the Green Book, HM Treasury Green Book, which means you have to do ex-ante appraisals. So, I mean, I just find it very strange that so many years later, we still don't have that system in this country. And that really is a good system to say, should we be spending public money here? Is it going to be of value, and what are our outcomes going to be, and what are our objectives going to be based on the data that you've created? And as you say, shared, everybody knows there's collective ownership, there's collective understanding of that data.
Okay, thank you for those reflections, Ali. I think maybe I should open it up to the floor at this stage. I'm just looking at the time.